The town of Natchez lay heavy under the Mississippi sun, its air thick with the perfume of magnolia and the stench of human misery. By 1843, it was one of the richest slaveholding communities in the South, a place where cotton built palaces and flesh built fortunes. The mansions that crowned the bluffs looked out over the river like silent overseers, their white columns gleaming against the muddy waters that carried bales of cotton down to New Orleans. Beneath that grandeur, in the quarters hidden behind the fields and down the winding canebrakes, another world existed, a world of whispers, hunger, and endurance. The enslaved people of Natchez had learned to read the landscape not in books or ledgers, but in the rustle of trees and the rhythm of footsteps in the dark. They had been taught that survival meant silence, but the silence had begun to crack. Among those who labored under that brutal sun was a man known simply as Isaac. He was tall, his shoulders bent from years of carrying sacks heavier than a man's hope. His hands were scarred, his eyes patient, and within him lived a fury older than his years. Isaac had been born in Natchez. He had never known another sky. His father had been sold when he was a child, and his mother died soon after from fever. He had seen enough to know that the promise of obedience only bought pain deferred. What stirred within him now was not the thought of vengeance for himself, but the memory of others, the women beaten for speaking out of turn, the boys whipped for learning letters, the elders buried nameless in shallow pits behind the sugar mill. He carried their ghosts as if they were his own blood. Rumors had begun to ripple through the quarters that year. Stories of uprisings further south, of insurrections whispered about in the night. The Haiti Revolution had long become legend among the enslaved, passed from one generation to the next as proof that freedom was not just a dream. But even within the United States, the stories of rebellion burned quietly beneath the surface. There were tales of Denmark Vesey in Charleston, of Nat Turner in Virginia, of small revolts crushed before they ever reached the newspapers. These stories were warnings to the planters, but to the enslaved they were scripture. They said, "It has been done before. It can be done again." In Natchez, the overseers believed they had stamped out such possibilities. They relied on the weight of fear, the gallows, the dogs, the patrols that prowled the woods. Yet beneath that system, bonds were forming in secret. The enslaved gathered in hush harbors deep in the swamps, where the trees themselves seemed to protect them. There, under the cover of night, they sang hymns that carried double meanings, songs of deliverance that were also plans of resistance. The old women who led prayers knew more than they said. The men who carved wooden crosses also sharpened hidden blades. Isaac became one of those who listened carefully, who weighed each word spoken in the dark. He did not speak of rebellion lightly, but he knew that submission had brought nothing but graves. The year had been cruel. Crops failed after a sudden flood, and punishments grew harsher. The overseer, a man named Crenshaw, had taken to whipping 2 people a day whether there was cause or not. It was said he did it to keep discipline, but those who felt his lash knew it was pleasure he sought. When a young girl named Dinah was found dead behind the cotton press, her neck marked by his hand, the quarter fell silent for 3 days. Even the children did not cry. Something in the air had shifted, as though the land itself was holding its breath. Isaac knew then that the time of endurance had reached its limit. Late one night, he met with others by the riverbank, men and women from neighboring plantations who had slipped away under the pretense of fetching water or tending to the sick. There was Reuben, who had once been a blacksmith before his master sold his tools, Clara, whose husband had been sent down the river for trying to run, and old Moses, who remembered Africa more clearly than his own children's faces. They spoke in low tones, their voices almost swallowed by the croaking of frogs. They talked not of anger, but of necessity. The white men had their laws, their whips, their god of chains. The enslaved would now make their own justice, not for vengeance alone, but to prove that their souls had not been broken. The plan was simple in its danger. On a Sunday night, when most of the masters were gathered in town for a meeting of the local militia, the enslaved would rise. They would strike at the overseers first, take their weapons, and move toward the armory at the edge of town. The goal was not to hold Natchez, it was to burn it, to send a message down the Mississippi that no plantation, no matter how grand, was beyond the reach of the enslaved. Some argued for flight instead, for stealing boats and disappearing into the swamps or further north. But Isaac knew what those escapes meant. Weeks of hunger, the endless chase, the dogs. Freedom that depended on running was a half measure. They have taken everything from us but our hands. one of the men said that night. Let them see what our hands can do. The days leading up to that night were marked by stillness so unnatural that even the masters noticed it. The laughter of children quieted. The field songs slowed. Isaac kept his head down, worked harder than ever, and waited. He saw Crenshaw swaggering by the barns, oblivious, his whip hanging like a tail. The man whistled as if the world would never change. But in the corners of the quarters, the others were sharpening tools, hiding axes beneath laundry barrels, preparing strips of cloth soaked in oil for torches. They prayed together quietly each night. Though the prayers had changed, they no longer asked for deliverance but for strength. When the night finally came, it arrived without wind. The sky was heavy, clouds pressing low as though the heavens themselves were waiting to witness what would unfold. Around midnight, Isaac rose from his pallet and stepped into the open air. The fields glistened faintly under a weak moon, rows of cotton shimmering like ghosts. From the distant quarters came a signal. 3 short notes of a wooden flute played softly and then silenced. It was time. He moved quickly, his bare feet silent on the dirt. At the barn, Reuben and Clara were already there. Reuben held a hammer, his knuckles white. They exchanged a look. No words, no turning back. The first blow fell like thunder in a dream. Crenshaw, roused from his sleep, stumbled into the doorway shouting, but the sound was cut short by the swing of an axe. Blood pooled darkly against the packed earth. There was no triumph, only breathless shock, as if the act itself had torn a hole in the world. Within moments, others struck across the fields, torches lighting the night, dogs barking frantically, shouts rising from every direction. Smoke began to climb into the air, carrying the scent of burning cane and something heavier beneath it. The enslaved moved like shadows, coordinated yet desperate, knowing that once the first fire was lit, there would be no going back. The flames spread fast. The main house caught before dawn, its white columns glowing orange as if the sun had risen inside it. The women gathered children and fled toward the woods, some crying, some singing hymns in trembling voices. Isaac led a small group toward the armory, hearts pounding, knowing the town's militia would soon respond. He did not think of survival now. He thought of Dinah, of his mother, of the countless names unrecorded in any ledger. Each step was for them, but Natchez was not unprepared. By morning, bells were ringing from the churches on the bluff. The local militia, planters, merchants, and their hired men, rode hard from town, rifles slung across their shoulders. The smoke rising from the plantations was visible for miles. By the time the riders reached the fields, the rebellion was already faltering. Fire consumed what they could not carry, and panic spread among those who had joined the fight. Some were captured on the road. Others fled into the bayous, pursued by dogs. Isaac and his group made it as far as the riverbank before they were surrounded. The militia shouted for them to surrender, their voices cutting through the crackling of burning wood. Isaac looked at the water, dark and endless, and knew what it meant. He would not be dragged back. He turned to the others and said something they could not fully hear over the roar of the flames, but its meaning was clear. They ran. Shots cracked the air. Some fell, some dove into the river, their bodies swallowed by the current. Isaac disappeared beneath the surface as dawn broke over Natchez, the water reflecting the fire that still burned behind him. For a moment, the Mississippi seemed to glow like molten gold, a cruel beauty born from suffering and defiance. By mid-morning, the rebellion was crushed. The papers would call it an uprising of Negroes, led by insolent field hands, and would praise the swift justice of the planters. The surviving captives were hanged within days, their bodies left on display near the courthouse as a warning. But in the quarters, in the swamps, in the hidden corners where whispers still lived, the story of that night would not die. It would be told in fragments and songs, in the careful tone of those who remembered both the terror and the glory of standing, even once, against the impossible. Once, against the impossible. The smoke over Natchez lingered for days. The fields were blackened, the scent of ash and sorrow drifting down the river. But somewhere, beyond the reach of patrols and punishments, there were those who had escaped, women, children, men carrying the story in their bones. They moved quietly through the woods, through the darkness, guided not by maps but by memory. And in that fragile memory, in that refusal to forget, the rebellion lived on. It was not victory they carried, but proof that even in the heart of bondage resistance had breathed, burned, and left its mark upon the land. The morning after the rebellion, Natchez awoke to a town transformed, not by the movement of law, but by the scars of fire and fury. Smoke still curled from the burned quarters and barns, mingling with the early mist of the Mississippi. The streets were empty, save for the patrols of militia, their boots heavy on the cobblestones, their eyes scanning every doorway and alley for the fugitives who had vanished into the swamps under the cloak of night. The planters emerged from their mansions with a mix of disbelief and rage, their silk waistcoats pressed and their hands trembling as they surveyed the destruction of property that had been theirs for generations. Windows were broken, fences toppled, and the scent of burned cotton hung thick and pungent, a reminder that wealth could be challenged even for a fleeting night. Yet beneath the fear and anger, an unease took root, a sense that the enslaved were no longer entirely predictable, no longer entirely silenced. In the quarters, those who had survived the initial wave of suppression moved cautiously, their steps deliberate, their breaths measured. Children clung to mothers whose faces were pale from grief, and the older men and women whispered in corners, sharing what news had been gathered from the river and the woods. Word traveled like water through reeds. Some of the rebels had been seen fleeing toward the bayou. Some had been captured and executed swiftly. Some, they hoped, had vanished into the wider swamps or found hidden routes northward. Each story carried both warning and inspiration. It was a delicate balance of grief and defiance, of sorrow and hope. Isaac, bruised but alive, had made it to a low ridge overlooking the river. He could see the smoke from Natchez curling upward, like a dark omen, and he felt in his chest the weight of responsibility, not only for himself but for all who had trusted him with their courage the night before. The swamps offered refuge, but they demanded everything. Isaac and those who had escaped with him moved through marsh and cane with a careful understanding of the land's rhythms. Every snapping branch, every rustle of leaves had to be considered. Water was both life and danger. The currents could drown the unwary, and predators, coyotes, snakes, alligators, lurked in the underbrush, drawn to movement and scent. Yet in this treacherous terrain, the fugitives found a kind of communion with the earth. They navigated by stars, by the moss that hung from trees, by the subtle incline of the land. Each day brought a new challenge, crossing swollen creeks, avoiding patrols, finding sustenance in roots, berries, and fish. Hunger gnawed at them, but survival honed their senses, their muscles, their will. They began to understand what their captors had never taught them, that freedom required not only courage, but knowledge of the land itself. In those first days, the group kept to the shadows, moving mostly at night and resting during the heat of the day. The elders taught the younger ones how to mimic the sounds of the swamp, how to whistle like birds to signal danger, how to break branches without leaving tracks, how to read the wind for approaching humans. Every gesture, every lesson, carried the weight of generations of survival. Isaac observed closely, noting who moved with instinct and who faltered. Among them were those who had spent years under the lash, but had never learned to truly navigate the world beyond the fields. He became a teacher as much as a leader, guiding them with patience, insisting on discipline, knowing that a single misstep could mean capture or death. Each night, as they huddled beneath cypress trees, he told them stories, not of conquest but of resistance, of lives lived with dignity even under oppression. Meanwhile, Natchez struggled to regain its composure. The planters, humiliated by the audacity of the rebellion, demanded swift and brutal justice. Militia officers patrolled the outskirts, interrogating anyone who might have offered aid, searching cabins and barns, threatening families with reprisals. The town council issued proclamations calling for loyalty, for vigilance, and for the eradication of subversive influences. Rumors circulated of harsher punishments to come, of entire plantations being patrolled by armed men. The fear was both real and performative, a display meant to intimidate not only the enslaved, but also the white working class who might sympathize. Yet the more the authorities sought to instill terror, the more stories of the rebellion filtered outward, carried by those who had escaped, or by the sympathetic few who whispered in the shadows. Isaac's group had no illusions about their future. Every day was a calculation. every decision a balance between risk and necessity. Water from the river had to be filtered. Food had to be gathered stealthily. They learned to use mud to cover footprints, to travel in single-file lines that mimicked the natural patterns of animals in the swamp. At night, the elders led small prayer circles, invoking ancestors and spirits to watch over them. These were not religious rituals in the narrow sense. They were acts of connection, of memory, of reclaiming a humanity that slavery had attempted to erase. Each prayer was a claim, a declaration that their lives were theirs, not property, not commodity. During one of these nights, Isaac noticed a patrol cutting through the marsh. He froze, signaling to the group to remain still. The horses passed, within yards, nostrils flaring, hooves crushing reeds, yet they never saw the fugitives. That night, Isaac understood the delicate balance between fear and freedom. Each narrow escape was both a blessing and a lesson. The world could be both hostile and malleable, depending on knowledge and patience. By morning, the swamp seemed almost serene, as if it had swallowed the danger whole. But the group knew better. Danger was always present, lurking beneath water and soil in the veneer of quiet. As the fugitives pressed northward, they began to encounter others who had fled before them. Some were families who had crossed rivers and plantations. Others were solitary men and women who had lost kin along the way. Each new face brought a story, a fragment of strategy, and sometimes a warning. Isaac listened to these narratives with care, piecing together a network of survival that extended far beyond Natchez. They spoke in muted tones of towns where the militia was particularly cruel, of safe havens where free blacks offered food and temporary shelter, and of hidden paths that led to larger rivers. Through these exchanges, Isaac realized the rebellion, though crushed in Natchez, had sparked ripples that extended across the region. They also began to confront the moral weight of their actions. Some among the group questioned the violence, wondering if the deaths inflicted on overseers were justified, or if the rebellion had placed others at risk. Isaac listened but remained firm in his conviction. He reminded them that the system they had lived under was built on violence, that every lash, every coerced labor, every death in the quarters was a result of a moral failure by those in power. To strike back, even fleetingly, was to reclaim the humanity that had been denied to them. These discussions, held in whispers beneath moss-draped trees, were acts of reckoning. They forged bonds among the group, a shared understanding of responsibility and consequence. By mid-April, the fugitives had reached the outer edges of the Pearl River. Here, the swamp opened into flatter lands, dotted with isolated cabins and the occasional small farm. Each stop required careful negotiation. They approached quietly, offering to work in exchange for shelter, or relying on the cautious hospitality of those who had some measure of sympathy for their plight. Some encounters were tense. Some landowners betrayed them for reward money, while others provided food and directions. Isaac had to constantly gauge trust, to weigh the potential cost of aid against the necessity of survival. In these moments, the rebellion extended beyond the night of fire and into the long work of endurance. Freedom was not a single act, but a continuous series of choices, each one fraught with peril. The nights along the Pearl River were heavy with humidity and the chorus of frogs and insects. The fugitives found temporary camps along elevated ridges to avoid flooding and predatory animals. Fire was limited to small, concealed embers, enough to cook food but not enough to betray their location. Each dawn brought a mixture of relief and dread. Relief that they had survived the night. Dread that patrols might appear. That hunger might gnaw more severely, or that illness might strike one of the weaker members. Clara, who had endured the whipping at Natchez, began to cough persistently, her body weakened by years of labor and the stress of flight. Isaac wrapped her in whatever cloth they had, but he knew that exposure to disease could claim life as surely as the lash or the bullet. Despite the hardships, there was also a growing sense of solidarity. Songs from the old quarters evolved into chants of hope, carrying codes of direction and timing. Children, though exhausted, began to learn the rhythm of the escape, their movements guided by elders who had survived decades of oppression. Isaac noticed how the land itself seemed to offer small signs, a break in the trees marking a safe path, a particular shape of moss indicating higher ground. Each observation became a tool for survival, and each success reinforced their belief that they could, for a time, shape their own destinies. The group encountered their first major obstacle when they came upon a plantation that had recently been reinforced with armed overseers and dogs. Hunting not just for runaways but for news of Natchez's uprising, Isaac scouted the area, observing the guards' routines, the placement of gates, the patrol patterns. The risk was immense, but they could not afford to stop. The only option was to move quickly, silently and decisively. Under the cover of a stormy night, they crossed through the back of the fields, ducking beneath low-hanging branches and crawling through mud-laden ditches. The dogs barked in the distance, confused by the human ghosts slipping through the earth. Every heart in the group pounded, every breath measured, every step a negotiation between life and death. By the time dawn broke, they had crossed safely, but the encounter left a mark. They were reminded that the world they were moving through was structured to crush them, to erase their bodies and spirits at a moment's notice. Yet each step forward, each narrow escape, strengthened their resolve. Isaac reminded them that Natchez had not broken them. The flames of the rebellion were no longer just fire on the bluff. They lived in the minds and hearts of those who refused to yield. They pressed onward, carrying both the memory of what had been lost and the determination to ensure that the legacy of the uprising would endure, even if only in whispers along the river, through the marshes, and across the lands that had been stolen from them. The fugitives pressed northward through the wetlands with a careful urgency, their movements dictated by the rhythms of the land and the faint knowledge that every step might carry them closer to either freedom or death. The swamps themselves seemed alive, not merely as obstacles but as guardians and testaments. Cypress knees jutted from murky water like skeletal fingers. Moss hung thick from low-hanging branches, and the air carried the musky scent of decay and life interwoven. Each night they moved silently, pausing to drink from the river and forage along the banks. Fish were speared with sharpened sticks, small birds snatched from hiding, roots peeled carefully from mud-soaked earth. Hunger gnawed at them constantly, yet the wildness of the terrain offered sustenance to those who could read its signs. Even in this unforgiving place there was a rhythm, a pulse that seemed to mirror the determination of the human hearts navigating it. Isaac had become more than a guide. He was a teacher, a leader, and a keeper of collective memory. He taught the others to move as shadows, to let the moonlight fall on the wrong side of their bodies, to mask their scent from the dogs that might be tracking them from the Natchez plantations. He pointed out edible plants, signaling those that were safe and those that could bring fever or death. Old Moses, who had survived the Middle Passage and countless plantations, reminded the group of hidden signs left by those who had fled before them. Small scratches on trees, arrangements of stones, markers in mud that indicated water depth or safe passage. These subtle signs became the language of survival, a code that linked generations of people who had refused captivity. Even the youngest children in the group learned to read the swamp, their eyes sharp for movement and reeds, their ears attuned to distant calls that might warn of approaching danger. As days stretched into weeks, the fugitives began to encounter other signs of resistance, evidence that Natchez's rebellion, though crushed in its immediate violence, had ripple effects beyond the bluffs. Crops were missing in distant fields, likely sabotaged in solidarity. Cabins along secondary paths held supplies left by sympathizers, and scraps of news arrived from travelers, suggesting that other groups had fled, some moving east, some following riverways northward. These fragments of information bolstered morale. They reminded the fugitives that while Natchez had been a disaster in terms of immediate survival, it had been a declaration, a challenge to the social order that could not easily be erased. In the whispering reeds and along the riverbanks, the story of that night was already becoming myth, carried by those who dared to listen. By the fourth week, fatigue had set in, and the strains of continuous flight were evident in every body. Clara's persistent cough worsened, a reminder that the swamp offered both refuge and threat. Isaac fashioned crude bandages from cloth, but he knew the limitations. A single fever could spread through the group, and the lawless wilderness could not heal what it did not possess. Yet the mental resilience of the fugitives was remarkable. They had been forged by labor, by cruelty, and by the constant reminder that each day they survived, they claimed a space for themselves in a world that had tried to erase them. The fire of the Natchez uprising still burned in their hearts, a symbolic ember that could not be snuffed by distance or fear. Along the banks of a tributary feeding into the Pearl River, they encountered a small settlement of free black families. The cabins were modest, constructed of hand-hewn logs and clay, and smoke from small hearths spiraled lazily into the sky. Here, for the first time in weeks, the fugitives could rest without the immediate threat of pursuit. Food was offered freely: cornmeal, smoked fish, and beans cooked over open flames. There was water from a well, clean and cool, and the first semblance of safety in weeks. Yet Isaac knew that any prolonged stay carried risk. Bounty hunters and patrols could arrive at any moment. Even in moments of reprieve, the fugitives learned to live with the tension between rest and readiness. The elders of the settlement told stories of past resistance. One woman recounted the tale of a small group of enslaved men who had once poisoned a sugarcane plantation near Baton Rouge, losing many lives in the process, but demonstrating that rebellion could strike fear into even the most entrenched systems. Another spoke of families who had lived for decades in semi-secrecy along river tributaries, offering assistance to runaways while evading capture themselves. These stories were instructive and inspirational, illustrating the long continuum of defiance against the slave system. Isaac listened carefully, memorizing routes, allies, and hazards mentioned in hushed tones. Each story expanded the network of survival, creating a map of hope and practicality that extended far beyond the immediate geography. The fugitives pressed on, navigating a mixture of riverbanks, overgrown fields, and dense woods. The landscape became increasingly difficult. Waterlogged lowlands gave way to thick underbrush, insects swarmed in clouds, and sudden rainstorms turned the earth into a quagmire. In these conditions, the group's resilience was tested repeatedly. Children stumbled and cried. The elderly suffered aches and fevers. Each step forward was a battle of endurance. Isaac maintained strict vigilance, ensuring that no one strayed from the line and that the group's formation remained tight. Every sound, branch snapping, bird call, splash of water, was noted and analyzed. They had learned to survive in the swamp, but survival required constant adaptation, patience, and unwavering attention to detail. During one particularly harrowing stretch, the fugitives encountered a plantation that had recently suffered a labor shortage. Overseers were on heightened alert, their eyes scanning the horizon, and dogs barked continuously. Isaac observed the patrol patterns over several nights, noting the change in schedules, the rotation of guards, and the places where human and canine vigilance overlapped. The group moved only after dark, slipping silently past sentries crawling under fences and crossing open fields with bodies pressed low to the ground. When they finally reached the edge of the property, the first light of dawn painted the plantation in gold and crimson. The fugitives paused, breathing heavily, hearts racing, not just from exertion, but from the knowledge that any misstep could end their journey. Despite the constant threats, there was also an emerging sense of camaraderie among the group. Shared hardship and mutual dependence created bonds stronger than any familial tie. They looked after one another, teaching the young how to fish and the old how to make improvised splints for injuries. They divided labor, gathering firewood, scouting ahead, and preparing food, each task vital for survival. Even in the face of relentless adversity, they found moments of human connection, of laughter, of prayer. Isaac recognized that these small acts were as crucial as their strategy and stealth. They preserved not only life but also the dignity that slavery had systematically stripped away. As they moved through the northern reaches of Mississippi, news of Natchez's rebellion continued to reach them in fragments. Travelers spoke of heightened security, of increased patrols, of harsher punishments meted out to those who had been caught. Some of these stories were terrifying, recounting hangings and floggings meant to deter any further defiance. Yet even in the face of such brutal reprisals, the fugitives were inspired by the courage displayed by those who had participated in the uprising. The knowledge that people had dared to take justice into their own hands gave meaning to every perilous step they took. Every mile they traveled was a continuation of that defiance, a statement that oppression could be resisted even at immense cost. By the time they reached the Yazoo River basin, the fugitives had transformed from a group of desperate escapees into a tightly knit unit, each member attuned to the other's movements and needs. They had learned the subtleties of the landscape, where water would rise and recede, which paths were most likely to be monitored, and which areas offered concealment. They were no longer merely fleeing. They were navigating, planning, and asserting agency in a world that had long denied them autonomy. Isaac's leadership had evolved from reactive guidance to proactive strategy. He understood that their journey was not merely about reaching safety, but about asserting control over their lives in a system designed to deny them every right. The fugitives also grappled with the psychological toll of their flight. Fear, grief, and anger intertwined, sometimes erupting into arguments or despair. Isaac mediated these moments with care, reminding them that unity was essential, that survival required more than courage. It required trust, patience, and mutual respect. They developed routines for coping, rotating watch shifts at night, storytelling to maintain morale, teaching songs that doubled as codes for safe passage. These rituals created structure in the chaos, a semblance of order in a life defined by uncertainty. Through this disciplined chaos, they nurtured hope, sustaining themselves with the knowledge that their rebellion, though suppressed in Natchez, had sparked a movement within them that could not be extinguished. The fugitives moved deeper into the forests and wetlands of northern Mississippi, the world around them shifting from the swampy lowlands into a tangle of hardwoods and hidden creeks. Here, the landscape offered both refuge and challenge. Dense thickets slowed their progress, while elevated ridges provided vantage points from which to observe patrols and distant smoke. Every footfall required careful calculation, every decision a negotiation between speed and stealth. Isaac, now the recognized leader of the group, had internalized the rhythms of the wilderness. He could sense the approach of storm clouds, read the direction of the wind to mask their scent, and anticipate the patrols that scoured the land for runaways. His leadership was not merely tactical, it was moral and spiritual. He carried the memory of Natchez's fallen, the young and the old who had been left behind, and used their courage to fortify the hearts of those who followed. Food and water remained an ongoing concern. The group had learned to fish with crude lines and spears, to dig roots that provided sustenance, and to forage for berries, nuts, and edible greens. Water from creeks and streams had to be filtered through cloth and boiled when possible, for contamination could swiftly incapacitate them. Each day demanded constant vigilance. They could not afford to become complacent, for the hunters from Natchez and other plantations were relentless. Isaac taught them to move silently, to recognize animal tracks versus human footprints, and to blend into shadows as naturally as the trees themselves. Every night, as they huddled beneath low-hanging branches, he would recount lessons from elders, tying practical survival skills to the stories of resistance that had carried their ancestors across continents. These narratives were as vital as the food they scavenged. They nourished courage, hope, and identity in a landscape designed to erase all three. The psychological weight of flight was as heavy as the physical strain. The fugitives were constantly haunted by memories of Natchez, the fire, the screams, the bodies left behind. Children whispered questions about parents who would never be found. Elders mourned comrades lost to the militia, and all carried the terror of capture like a shadow stretching across every step. Yet within this darkness was also resilience. The group had begun to understand the power of unity, of collective strategy, and of the moral imperative that had driven them to rebel. Each narrow escape, each night spent under the stars without discovery, reinforced a profound truth. The system that had sought to enslave them could be defied. The memory of the uprising was no longer a single act of violence. It was an ongoing assertion of autonomy, a statement that even in defeat, their humanity had prevailed. During one stretch of particularly dense forest, the fugitives encountered a settlement of free black families who had long existed in semi-secrecy, along hidden tributaries. These families had constructed modest cabins of logs and clay, sustaining themselves with small gardens, fishing, and occasional bartering with sympathetic neighbors. The fugitives were cautiously welcomed, though the host demanded secrecy and vigilance. Here, for the first time in weeks, they could rest without the constant pressure of pursuit. Fires were small, meals simple, and conversations carefully muted to avoid revealing their presence to outsiders. These temporary havens provided more than physical sustenance. They offered lessons in self-reliance, community organization, and the small but vital practices that kept free black communities alive in a hostile region. Isaac took advantage of these stops to plan the next stage of the journey. The goal was no longer simply to survive, It was to move toward safety while cultivating intelligence about the wider network of resistance and aid. They learned of sympathetic allies further north, along the river routes and hidden paths that connected plantations to free black enclaves. Stories of bounty hunters, informants, and plantation patrols underscored the stakes. One misstep could result in recapture, brutal punishment, or death. Yet with each story, Isaac and his group became more disciplined, more strategic, and more attuned to the dangers that surrounded them. The lessons of the swamps and the stories of other survivors were merged into a careful, deliberate plan for continued movement. As they progressed, the fugitives faced both natural and human threats. Rivers had swollen after spring rains, requiring the group to construct makeshift rafts or find narrow crossings. Swollen banks threatened to sweep away those who attempted to wade across, and hidden sinkholes in the mud claimed shoes, clothing, and sometimes balance itself. Even in the water, predators lurked. Alligators and snakes waited for unwary travelers, forcing the fugitives to adopt constant caution. Each crossing tested their resourcefulness. Planks were lashed together with strips of cloth, logs balanced across currents, and watch rotations ensured that no one ventured alone. The swamp had become both a teacher and an adversary, demanding ingenuity and courage at every step. Human threats were ever present. Plantation patrols had learned of their escape and had extended their search northward. Isaac instructed the group to move only at night or under heavy fog, to avoid open fields and to mimic animal sounds to conceal human presence. They learned to hide in hollow trees, beneath brush, and in shallow water when search parties drew near. Every encounter with a patrol reinforced the brutal reality of the society from which they had fled. Freedom was fragile, and the cost of failure was immediate and irreversible. Yet the fugitives pressed on, driven by the memory of Natchez and the imperative to survive for those who could not fight for themselves. During one particularly tense night, the group observed lights from a distant plantation. They paused in silence, listening to the sounds of barking dogs and shouting voices. Isaac signaled the group to drop low into the reeds and remain motionless. Hours passed before the threat passed, yet the tension left its mark. The fugitives were reminded that even after weeks of flight, they were still hunted, still vulnerable, and still reliant on each other for survival. These moments reinforced the lessons of the swamp. Patience, observation, and unity were as essential as strength and endurance. Each night they built small fires for warmth and cooking, but always with caution, ensuring that smoke and light would not reveal their position to distant eyes. Despite the hardships, moments of quiet reflection allowed the fugitives to reclaim some semblance of humanity. They sang songs softly, often with double meanings that conveyed messages about direction, danger, or reassurance. They shared stories of ancestors and events from the Natchez uprising, weaving a collective memory that fortified morale. Isaac encouraged these practices, understanding that psychological resilience was as important as physical survival. The swamp was not merely a place of danger, it was also a space of transformation, where courage, ingenuity, and memory intertwined to create a living testament to defiance. The group also contended with illness, an ever-present threat in the humid wetlands. Fevers, rashes, and infections spread quickly, and without access to proper medicine, even minor ailments could become life-threatening. Isaac improvised remedies, drawing on knowledge passed down by elders. Certain roots boiled in water could reduce fever, while leaves applied to wounds could prevent infection. The process was slow and painstaking, and the mortality rate was high, yet the group learned to care for one another with meticulous attention. Each act of healing reinforced bonds and created a sense of mutual responsibility, a recognition that survival depended not only on individual effort, but on the collective strength of the group. By the time they reached the outskirts of the Yazoo River Basin, the fugitives had become a disciplined, resilient unit. Each member knew their role. Scouts moved ahead to observe patrols. The sick and young were protected in the center of the group, and Isaac orchestrated movements with the precision of a general leading troops through hostile territory. They had learned the landscape intimately, from hidden inlets to safe havens, and had developed a network of information that extended far beyond their immediate surroundings. The rebellion in Natchez had sparked this journey, and though the initial uprising had been brutally suppressed, the spirit of resistance persisted. Each mile traveled was both a continuation of that defiance and a testament to human endurance in the face of relentless oppression. The fugitives moved steadily through the dense forests and marshlands, the terrain growing increasingly treacherous as they pressed farther from Natchez. The swamps gave way to patchy uplands and ridges where visibility improved, but so did the risk of exposure. Every ridge crest, every open patch of ground had to be crossed with calculation. Even a single misstep could alert the patrols who scoured the region for fugitives. Isaac had become an instinctive observer of the landscape, reading subtle signs in the wind, the patterns of birds, and the movement of livestock to gauge human activity. His mind had evolved into a map of threats and safe passages, constantly updating with each step, each encounter, each whisper of danger. The group's survival depended not merely on speed, but on the ability to anticipate and respond to a hostile environment. Both natural and human, supplies were meager, and hunger gnawed at the edges of endurance. They had grown adept at foraging, fishing, and trapping, yet each day demanded careful rationing. The elders instructed the young on how to gather roots that provided energy, berries that could stave off scurvy, and small game that could be caught with patience and precision. Isaac emphasized that the swamp and forest were both provider and test, requiring respect and attentiveness. Each meal, each sip of water from filtered streams was a triumph, a small reclaiming of agency over bodies that had long been denied autonomy. These acts of sustenance were interwoven with lessons of patience and observation, reinforcing the principle that freedom required knowledge, discipline, and constant vigilance. As they moved north, the fugitives began to encounter communities of free black families and sympathetic allies who had long existed in semi-secrecy along river tributaries and remote uplands. These small settlements were constructed with careful planning. Cabins were hidden among trees, gardens provided sustenance, and watchtowers or hidden posts allowed for early detection of patrols. Here the fugitives were briefly welcomed, offered food, and instructed in the routes and methods used by those who had successfully evaded capture for years. Isaac listened intently, memorizing every path, every landmark, and every potential danger. These encounters were as crucial as any physical skill. They provided intelligence, strategy, and a broader understanding of a network that had resisted oppression quietly for decades. Yet even in these temporary havens, danger was never far. Rumors of bounty hunters, patrols, and informants traveled quickly. The fugitives learned that some landowners were eager to profit from the return of runaways, while others were quietly sympathetic. Decisions about where to rest and whom to trust required careful consideration, constant observation, and an understanding of human behavior sharpened by desperation and experience. Isaac emphasized discipline. Movement had to be coordinated, trust had to be earned, and caution was a constant companion. Any lapse could result in capture, floggings, or death, and the memory of Natchez's brutality haunted each step, reinforcing the stakes of their journey. The group's cohesion was tested repeatedly. Children struggled with fatigue, elders battled weakness, and illness threatened to claim the vulnerable. Clara, whose cough had worsened, required constant care, and the group had to adapt to ensure her survival. Isaac improvised treatments from roots, bark, and herbs, guided by knowledge passed down from elders who had survived centuries of oppression. Each act of care was also an act of resistance, asserting the group's right to life and dignity in defiance of a society designed to deny both. These moments reinforced bonds, created trust, and strengthened morale, reminding the fugitives that survival was as much a collective endeavor as a personal struggle. The moral complexity of the journey weighed heavily on the group. They had witnessed the violence of the rebellion in Natchez, the deaths of overseers, the destruction of property, and the brutal reprisals that followed. Some questioned the righteousness of their flight, fearing that continued movement might endanger others or draw vengeance upon innocent communities. Isaac addressed these concerns with careful reasoning. The system that had enslaved them was violent and unrelenting, and acts of resistance were necessary to reclaim their humanity. Every decision to move, hide, or engage in small acts of sabotage was framed not merely as survival, but as an ethical assertion of freedom against oppression. As they pressed along the Yazoo River basin, the terrain became more challenging. Swollen streams, dense underbrush, and treacherous mud slowed progress. Night travel became essential, and small contingents were sent ahead as scouts while the main body rested under low-hanging trees. Each night was fraught with tension. Patrols could appear without warning, wild animals lurked, and the risk of injury or illness remained ever present. The fugitives developed routines to maintain security: watch shifts, silent signals, and subtle markers to indicate safe paths. Every step was measured, every movement deliberate, as the wilderness itself became both a shield and a test of resilience. The fugitives also grappled with the psychological toll of sustained flight. Memories of Natchez, the fire, the screams, the loss, haunted dreams and waking hours alike. Children asked questions about parents who would never be found. Elders mourned those left behind. Everyone carried the invisible burden of fear and uncertainty. Yet within this collective grief emerged extraordinary resilience. They supported one another, taught skills, shared stories, and built rituals that reinforced identity and courage. Songs sung softly along the river conveyed hope and direction, and stories of resistance linked past struggles to present survival. Each act of storytelling, each song, was a declaration that their lives were theirs, that memory and agency could not be stripped away, even in flight. The fugitives faced constant ethical and tactical decisions. Some families they passed along the river had previously offered aid, while others were hostile or indifferent. Isaac's leadership became more strategic. Decisions were informed by observation, intelligence, and moral judgment. Who to trust, when to hide, and how to move were questions that carried life or death consequences. Each encounter, each observation of human behavior, became a lesson in the complexities of survival under oppression. In this environment, the moral clarity of rebellion intertwined with the practical necessity of discretion, creating a discipline that was as much about ethics as survival. During one stretch of travel, the group faced a significant challenge. A plantation reinforced with armed overseers and hounds blocked the most direct route. Isaac observed from a distance, studying guard patterns and the dogs' patrol routes. He devised a plan. The group would move under cover of heavy fog, following a convoluted path that required wading through shallow waters and traversing muddy embankments. Every step was measured, every movement silent as the fugitives navigated the hazards. The dogs barked and scrambled in confusion, but the group pressed on, relying on skill, patience, and instinct. When they finally reached the opposite edge, the first rays of dawn illuminated their success. Exhaustion was tempered by relief, a reminder that ingenuity and discipline could triumph even over immediate danger. As they moved further north, the fugitives' understanding of the wider landscape deepened. Rivers, creeks, and tributaries became not just obstacles, but avenues of movement and sources of sustenance. The dense forests provided concealment, and the whispers of sympathetic communities offered guidance and support. Every mile traveled was a reinforcement of agency, every successful crossing a testament to courage and knowledge. The memory of Natchez, though painful, had become a source of inspiration, a reminder that rebellion was both an act of justice and a foundation for continued resistance. The fugitives pressed into the northern reaches of Mississippi with a tense mixture of exhaustion and determination, the landscape becoming increasingly difficult to navigate. The forest thickened into dark canopies where sunlight barely touched the forest floor, and marshy lowlands stretched between ridges, hiding both opportunity and peril. Every step demanded vigilance. The slightest sound could betray them to the patrols still scouring the region, and even minor injuries or illness could compromise the entire group. Isaac moved at the forefront, reading the subtle cues of the environment, the bend of a river, the shape of moss on a tree, the call of distant birds, and translating them into tactical guidance. He had become the embodiment of instinct and strategy, a leader who balanced immediate survival with the broader goal of freedom. Food and water remained constant concerns. Fish were caught in narrow channels with improvised spears. Roots dug carefully from the muddy banks, and small game trapped with patient ingenuity. Foraging required both knowledge and caution. Poisonous plants were abundant, and contaminated water could strike down a member of the group in hours. Isaac taught his companions to recognize signs in the natural world, to discern patterns in the behavior of animals, and to anticipate seasonal changes that might affect food availability. Hunger was a constant presence, gnawing at the body while demanding ingenuity to meet its needs. Yet each meal taken from the land reinforced agency, a reclaiming of sustenance denied to them for so long under slavery. The psychological toll of flight was equally relentless. Memories of Natchez, the fires, the screams, the deaths of comrades haunted every step. Children whispered about parents and siblings who had been lost. Elders mourned those captured or killed, and every member carried fear like a second skin. Yet even in the weight of grief, courage persisted. The shared trauma of the rebellion became a source of solidarity, a bond that intertwined memory, experience, and purpose. Isaac reminded the group that each step forward was both an act of survival and a continuation of the resistance begun in Natchez, a declaration that the oppression that had once defined their lives could no longer dictate their destiny. Encounters with sympathetic allies along the rivers and forest edges offered respite, knowledge, and connection. Free black communities, hidden from the surveillance of slave patrols and planters, provided temporary shelter, guidance, and intelligence about the surrounding terrain. These communities had long existed in semi-secrecy, surviving through careful concealment, shared vigilance, and collective memory. The fugitives were welcomed cautiously, as the arrival of a new group could bring danger. Meals were shared, clothing mended, and stories of other escapes passed quietly around campfires. Isaac absorbed these lessons, memorizing routes, noting safe havens, and internalizing warnings about bounty hunters or hostile neighbors. Each interaction extended a network of resistance, offering not only physical aid but also psychological reinforcement, the knowledge that they were part of a larger struggle against oppression. The natural environment posed unrelenting challenges. Rivers rose with spring rains, forcing the group to construct makeshift rafts or find precarious crossings. Muddy embankments threatened to swallow boots and feet, while unseen sinkholes concealed water deep enough to sweep a child or elder away. Predators, alligators, snakes, and panthers prowled the wetlands, and every movement required caution. Isaac emphasized patience, observation, and silent coordination. Scouts were sent ahead to test paths, and watch shifts rotated meticulously through the night. The wilderness was not merely an obstacle. It was a test of skill, discipline, and the ability to act as one unit. Human threats were never far behind. Patrols from plantations extended northward, eager to capture those who had fled Natchez. Isaac taught the group to use misdirection, to move under fog or darkness, and to mimic the sounds of the swamp to conceal human activity. They learned to hide in hollows, beneath brush, or in shallow water when danger approached. Each successful evasion reinforced discipline, patience, and trust. Each miscalculation could be fatal, and the constant threat heightened every sense, sharpening instincts honed by necessity and fear. The fugitives became experts in reading subtle signs, the shift of light across marshes, the distant bark of dogs, the cadence of distant voices. Despite constant danger, moments of humanity persisted. The group sang softly to maintain morale, often using coded messages in the lyrics. Stories of past rebellions and escaped slaves were shared, reinforcing collective memory and courage. Isaac encouraged these rituals, understanding that maintaining identity and psychological resilience was as critical as evading capture. The swamp, harsh and unforgiving, also became a crucible of transformation. Fear tempered into discipline, desperation into strategy, and grief into solidarity. Each mile traveled strengthened their bonds, teaching them that survival required more than endurance. It required cohesion, memory, and hope. Illness remained a constant threat. Clara's cough worsened into fever, and other members struggled with exhaustion and malnutrition. Isaac improvised treatments using herbs, bark, and roots, guided by the knowledge of elders who had survived decades of oppression. Caring for one another became an act of both necessity and resistance, asserting the group's right to live with dignity. Every small healing ritual reinforced unity, trust, and the recognition that survival was a collective effort. Each day that they continued to move was both a victory and a rehearsal of resilience. The moral weight of their flight persisted. Some among the group questioned the consequences of their rebellion, the lives lost, the risks taken, and the possible retaliation against those who had helped them. Isaac reminded them that the system they had fled from was inherently violent, built on the denial of humanity, labor, and autonomy. Resistance, in whatever form it took, was a necessary act of justice. Each decision to press forward, to navigate dangerous paths, and to claim moments of respite was both practical and ethical, reflecting a moral understanding honed under conditions of extreme oppression. The group confronted a particularly dangerous stretch along a plantation reinforced with armed overseers and hounds. Isaac observed for days, mapping patrol patterns, studying guard rotations, and identifying hidden gaps in vigilance. When the fog descended one evening, they moved with precise coordination, crawling under fences, wading through shallow water, and advancing with the silent discipline of those who understood that any noise, any misstep could be fatal. The barking of dogs and the confusion of guards passed like a test of nerve and skill, and by dawn the fugitives had reached a ridge safely. Relief mingled with exhaustion, but the incident reinforced lessons of observation, patience, and courage. Each danger navigated without capture strengthened both practical and moral resolve. Through rivers, forests, and wetlands, the fugitives' knowledge of the broader region deepened. They mapped routes in their minds, noting rivers, tributaries, and hidden paths. Observing signs left by sympathetic communities and previous fugitives, they created a mental map that expanded the network of resistance. Knowledge became power, and each successful maneuver through hostile territory was both survival and a reclaiming of agency. The memory of Natchez, though painful, served as a guiding light, a reminder that the struggle against oppression was ongoing, that acts of courage, however costly, echoed beyond immediate circumstances. The fugitives' cohesion and discipline were now remarkable. Each member understood their role. Scouts assessed danger ahead, children and the sick were protected at the center, and Isaac orchestrated movements like a general managing troops in hostile terrain. Every night was a rehearsal of vigilance and cooperation. Watch rotations, signals, and markers ensured the group moved safely through an environment that sought to erase them. The rebellion of Natchez, though violently suppressed, had evolved into a living continuum. The act of flight itself was resistance. Each decision and maneuver a statement of defiance, each survival a testament to the enduring human spirit. The fugitives pressed onward, the forest gradually thinning into rolling hills and upland plains that offered both visibility and new dangers. The farther north they moved, the more the terrain demanded constant vigilance. There were fewer hiding spots, and patrols increasingly patrolled these transitional lands, anticipating the paths of those fleeing Natchez. The group's survival had become an intricate dance of observation, timing, and trust. Isaac's leadership had evolved into a nuanced orchestration. He read the subtle changes in the landscape, interpreted the flight paths of animals for human threats, and coordinated the group's movement with almost instinctual precision. Every decision carried the weight of life and death, every pause and step an exercise in strategy, honed by weeks of flight and reflection on the night of rebellion that had set their journey in motion. Food and water remained a daily negotiation with the land. The uplands offered game, rabbits, quail, and the occasional deer, but hunting required patience and skill. Streams, though cleaner than the swamp waters, sometimes ran shallow or were controlled by landowners aware of fugitive movements. The group foraged roots, gathered wild greens, and fished where possible, always mindful of conserving strength and avoiding detection. Each meal, no matter how modest, was a reclamation of autonomy, a rejection of the hunger imposed by slavery, and a testament to their ingenuity. Isaac emphasized that understanding the land was not merely a matter of survival, but also a moral and spiritual practice. To navigate without harming what sustained them was an assertion of their humanity in a world that had tried to strip it away. The psychological strain of the journey was relentless. Nights brought dreams haunted by the Natchez fires, the screams of those who had fallen, and the fear of capture. Children asked questions that could not be answered. Elders grieved those they had left behind. The fugitive group bore collective trauma, yet within it also emerged solidarity. Shared hardship created bonds stronger than kinship, and mutual dependence became the scaffolding of survival. They sang softly to maintain morale, told stories of rebellion and escape, and passed down lessons from older survivors. Each ritual, each tale reinforced a shared identity, and every mile traversed became a declaration that slavery's attempt to erase them had failed. Encounters with sympathetic allies continued to shape the journey. Free black settlements and secret safe houses offered temporary respite, intelligence, and connection. These communities had long existed under the radar, relying on secrecy, vigilance, and intergenerational knowledge. Each visit taught new routes, provided supplies, and reinforced a sense of belonging to a broader continuum of resistance. Isaac treated these encounters with caution. Discretion was paramount, as betrayal by even a single individual could endanger all. The fugitives internalized the lessons. Survival depended not only on skill and courage, but also on trust, observation, and the ethical discernment of whom to approach. Illness and injury tested the group as relentlessly as patrols and environmental hazards. Fever, malnutrition, and exhaustion threatened their progress. Isaac improvised remedies with herbs, roots, and bark, guided by ancestral knowledge passed down from elders who had endured slavery's brutality. Caring for one another became an act of moral resistance as much as practical necessity. Each act of healing was a statement that their lives, bodies, and dignity belonged to them, not to the system that sought to claim them. Over time, the group learned to manage risk collectively, ensuring that each member's welfare reinforced the cohesion and resilience essential for survival. The fugitives' tactical knowledge had grown profound. They could read patrol patterns, anticipate bounty hunters' strategies, and navigate treacherous rivers and marshes. Isaac organized the group into roles: scouts ahead to detect danger, the infirm protected in the center, and others monitoring the rear. Every movement was deliberate, every stop calculated. Nights were spent under concealed cover, the faintest fire or signal a potential hazard. The wilderness was both ally and adversary. It offered concealment and sustenance but demanded constant adaptation. The lessons of Natchez, strategy, courage, and defiance were etched into every decision, guiding them through a landscape designed to crush freedom. As they crossed the last of the southern Mississippi ridges, the fugitives faced one of the final, most treacherous tests. A well-patrolled plantation sprawled across a strategic passage, its fences reinforced and guards rotated with careful diligence. Isaac observed for days, noting the timing of patrols and the dogs' behavior, waiting for an opportune moment. When fog rolled in one evening, the group moved like shadows, crawling beneath fences, wading through shallow water, and advancing in perfect silence. Every heart pounded with the tension of near discovery, every step a negotiation with fear itself. By dawn, they had passed safely. Relief was tempered by exhaustion, but the incident underscored the lessons that had carried them this far: patience, discipline, and unwavering unity. By the time they reached the northern borderlands of Mississippi, the fugitives had transformed. They were no longer simply escaping, they were navigating, surviving, and asserting agency in a hostile world. The memory of Natchez had become a moral compass and a source of inspiration. Each act of survival, every evasion of capture, and every quiet meal shared in the woods was an ongoing assertion of resistance. The landscape, once a barrier, had become a teacher. Every river crossing, ridge, and forested path honed resilience, cunning, and courage. The group's identity had evolved into one defined not by captivity, but by determination, solidarity, and the refusal to relinquish autonomy. The ethical weight of their actions remained ever present. Some members wrestled with fear that their movement might imperil those who helped them, or draw retribution on sympathetic communities. Isaac reminded them that the society they fled was structured to enforce oppression, that self-preservation and resistance were intertwined, and that their survival was itself a moral imperative. Decisions were framed as exercises in justice, prudence, and responsibility, balancing the risks of action with the necessity of asserting freedom. The fugitives internalized this perspective, understanding that each step, each choice, was a continuation of Natchez's defiance and a living testament to human resilience. Even as the fugitives neared relative safety, the landscape and human threats remained unforgiving. Rivers had to be crossed cautiously, forested paths navigated silently, and vigilance maintained at all times. Isaac's leadership combined careful planning with moral guidance, ensuring that the group moved not only efficiently but ethically. Each challenge, whether illness, hunger, or exposure to danger, was met with collective problem-solving, resourcefulness, and courage. The fugitives had become experts in both the physical and psychological demands of sustained flight, their survival reflecting a blend of skill, memory, and unyielding determination. In the final stretches, the group began to glimpse the promise of freedom beyond Mississippi. rumors of safe passage along river routes, settlements of free black communities in Tennessee and beyond, and sympathetic neighbors offered both hope and practical guidance. Isaac instructed the group to move carefully, to maintain discipline, and to approach these areas with both courage and caution. The journey, which had begun as an escape from Natchez, had evolved into a broader expedition, a testament to resilience, strategic acumen, and the unbreakable human will. The spirit of the rebellion, though violently suppressed, had carried them northward, shaping every decision, every movement, and every act of survival. By the time they crossed the final river into safer territory, the fugitives were transformed. Their bodies bore the marks of the journey, scars, calluses, and exhaustion etched into their very being. Their minds carried the memories of those left behind, the lessons of survival, and the enduring inspiration of Natchez's defiance. Each member had evolved from a hunted individual into a disciplined, resilient, and morally aware participant in a broader struggle for freedom. Their journey demonstrated that even in the wake of brutal suppression, resistance could endure, and human courage could carve a path through the most oppressive of circumstances. The night of their final encampment before leaving Mississippi was one of quiet reflection. Fires burned low, the air heavy with both relief and remembrance. Isaac moved among the group, observing the faces of children, elders, and adults alike. Faces marked by fear, exhaustion, and determination. He reminded them that while the immediate danger had passed, the struggle against the forces of oppression was ongoing. Survival was not merely a physical accomplishment. It was a declaration that freedom was their right, that memory and moral agency could not be extinguished, and that the human spirit could endure beyond brutality, fire, and blood. As dawn broke, the fugitives prepared for the final leg of their journey. The rivers, forests, and hills that had tested them had also taught them resilience, strategy, and moral resolve. The memory of Natchez, the fire, the deaths, the rebellion, remained a guiding force, shaping not only their understanding of justice, but also their approach to the uncertain future. Each mile traveled had been both an act of survival and a continuation of resistance, a living testament that oppression could be defied. Their journey, though far from over, had already rewritten